Welcome to Be Well with MS podcast series, where I and expert guests discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life to preserve brain health and quality of life living with MS. I'm Dr. Agnes Trokjane, neurologist, researcher, innovator at Torbay and South Devon NHS Foundation Trust in the UK. So today's guest is Dr. Andrea Stennett. She's a research neurophysiotherapist whose interest and passion lies in the area of adult neurorehabilitation and disability management. Andrea studied physiotherapy at the University Hospital of West Indies. She later moved to London and completed a Master of Science degree in neurorehabilitation and PhD in health science research at Brunel University. Andrea currently works with the BARS MS team and at the Wollaston Institute of Population Health, Queen's Mary University of London. Outside her working responsibilities, she's a member of the Association of Chartered Physiotherapists in Neurology for the London region and served as the Educational and Research Officer. Andrea firmly believes that bridging the gap between the clinical practice and research creates the opportunity to deliver an evidence-based perspective in the rehabilitation of people generally and those living with long-term conditions. She has worked on a number of the clinical trials involving people with multiple sclerosis. Her research interests include exploring the exercise and physical activity priorities of people with multiple sclerosis and finding ways to embed these into routine clinical practice. So welcome to the show, Andrea. How are you today?
Hi, Agne. Thank you for inviting me. I'm quite well.
Wonderful.
Quite well. A bit chilly, but well.
Yeah, it's snowing where I am at the moment, so it's really romantic. It brings such a special Christmas vibes because it's until the Christmas arrives. So it's such a magical time for us all. Andrea, the reason why we're here,
Absolutely.
We are talking about the brain health and how to preserve the brain health. And all we're going to discuss today is around the benefits of exercising, living with multiple sclerosis. So to start with, Andrea, I would like to know what does the brain health means to you as a person? Take me through your morning or evening routine. How does it look like?
Right, that's a very good question. So for me, brain health has to do with how we function in life. So I think about movement, how we move, the quality of our movement. I think about cognition, how we learn, how we think, how we remember. I think about emotions and behaviors. So when I try to think of brain health and how to embed that in my day-to-day life, there are snippets of this that happens, but I would say every day is a little bit different. So I'm not sure if I'd say routine. I would say practices. There are certain things that I practice as part of my routine, but every day is a little bit different because I'm coming from work or I'm doing other things. So what I do on one day or one evening in the week for around 60 minutes, I do like body conditioning exercise. And then another evening of the week, I do boxing, which is something new that I've started this year.
It's quite impactful,
but it's
really heavy work, I have to say.
It is. So, but that's quite fun, and it really gets you going. And then because it's getting later and later by the time I get home and darker, on the weekends, I have one day where I go out and be amongst nature. I have lovely parks where I live, so I tend to go for a walk in the park, listen to the birds. I know it sounds very cliche, but the breeze as it goes through the trees and the rustling, I enjoy that, and I think it gives me a great boost. So that's something that I do religiously as well. And the other thing I would mention is, as I said, these are practices that I do as part of my routine. In the evenings when I'm coming home from work on the train, I'll grab one of the papers and I'll be doing a puzzle. So whereas I spoke a lot about initially about what I'm doing in terms of movement, this is where cognition comes in. And the thing about doing crossword puzzles for me is that even if I don't get a word, for example, I know the next day, if I pick up a paper, it will have the answers. I don't think of it as cheating. I think of it as learning. So I'll go back and I'll say, okay, that's what that means. And the thing with crossword puzzles with the papers is that a few weeks later, the same word will come back. And so you will know whether or not you learned it. And if you don't, you can always go back and remind yourself. So that's something that I do routinely.
Wow.
And I love music as well. So listening to music, playing music, going to musicals. So I see brain health as spilling over into physical health and mental health, spilling over into how we interact with life and our surroundings and our occupation. So yeah, I see it as a whole and encompassing term.
So beautiful, Andrea. I've never thought to utilize this time whilst you're on the tram or train or tube or any public transport to use that time efficiently by educating yourself, keeping your mind up and running and being so efficient in learning new things. And the way you present it is an amazing way. So it's such a beautiful way to preserve your brain health from the cognitive perspective. We do tend to say to people, read books and do some sort of maybe play some games, table games with the families. And now the Christmas is coming, and it's so important to keep connected with other people and keep your mind occupied. Because I know that if you let your mind wander, I think that there is a research behind that. Wandering mind is unhappy mind. There's a whole publication around this. They're really occupying, being focused, performing, doing some readings and doing some crosswords is the way forward. And then if you merge that with a physical activity, it's not necessarily needs to be a boxing, Andrea, because you have to be fit for that. I guess, combining that with a simple park walking is the way forward.
Absolutely.
But if you can, of course, you can escalate that, to boxing exercise.
Absolutely. And, I'm no expert, I've only just started. But the great thing is anyone can do it. So yeah, whatever you can do, I think being active is the way to go.
Wonderful. So moving into more science, Andrea, so talking about the exercises and what the impact and role is in multiple sclerosis is a disease. And how does that prevent from having disease activity and building disability over the time? What is the role of exercise, generally talking, in multiple sclerosis?
Oh, it's a very good question, actually. So we know that there is a growing body of evidence. So there's literature suggesting that exercise has this neuroprotective effect in MS. There is evidence to suggest, particularly, that aerobic exercise preserves gray matter volume and white matter integrity. And these findings, and we've known that for some time, actually. So that study came out around 2010 or thereabouts. So we've known that for some time. But these findings, I think, are very important because we know the gray matter is involved with the control of movement, memory, with emotions. And we know as well, in particular, with people with MS, that there is a significant decline in global gray matter volume. And this decline is often linked with neurodisability, as measured with the expanded disability status scale, the EDSS scale, and cognitive impairment. But there is also emerging evidence around higher fitness levels. So if you participate in regular activity, this can improve your information processing speed, which is linked to cognitive performance. So there's quite a number of evidence coming out about this protective nature of exercise on the brain itself. Both in terms of the anatomy and the biology of the brain.
Wow. That's an impressive, how impactful it is and how important it is. I think that there are some older generation patients that they used to be told that there's nothing you can do about MS once you are diagnosed. This is such a wrong concept, and I think there were a couple of my patients that again come from 90s that they were diagnosed, and they still keep going with living with MS. They say that it might be so harmful exercises, so such a wrong sort of understanding about this condition. And I think you just diffuse that sort of a confusion around this, so it's really important to keep going and doing some minimal exercise, because it's good for your physical tone in your body, it's good for your cognition, it improves your performance, and it's a powerful tool for symptom management, isn't it?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. When you pull studies together that have looked at exercise and the role exercise play in terms of symptom management, it's overwhelming, the evidence really around improvement in mobility, depression, fatigue. And people will often say to you, I can't exercise because, I feel wiped out at the end of it. But in actual fact, if you look at the evidence base around exercise, it improves fatigue. So that's a paradox. So that's at a symptom level. And we've known this for years, actually. And you're right, when you look at the historical context around exercise, about 25, 30 years ago, people were advised against it. But there's so much evidence coming out now about the beneficial effects around exercise and actually the safety. So before, one of the concerns was around the detrimental effect of exercise in people with MS. But now we have lots of studies showing actually it is safe for people with MS. And when you look at brain health, in particular, in terms of the effect on brain health, we see that there is this positive association between physical activity and hippocampal volume. And that has to do with, memory and learning. We know that there's the association as well with physical activity and a reduction in lesion number. We know that that has a knock-on impact on disease activity. And there was a recent study that I came across, which I thought was brilliant, because what the authors showed is that people who perform in regular exercise, irrespective of their disability levels or their cognitive capabilities, it showed that regular participation maintained their brain volume. So often we're always thinking about improvement. But actually, if you can maintain function in people with MS, I think that's a great thing as well. So lots of effects.
Yes, yeah, Andrea. And I think a lot of people, what I hear in my clinics, that it puts them away a little bit, and they struggle because of the Udhoff's phenomenon. When you exercise, the body temperature rise and your symptoms of MS may flare up. And that's so natural and normal. You're not harming your body, you're not harming your brain at all by exercise. Although it may feel that you're more having tingling, you're getting more pains and aches, and you're more fatigued after you exercise. This is very transient and well-established and known phenomenon, which we call Udhoff's phenomenon. Yes. So don't worry about too much about this. This is a message to patients. Carry on. You're actually improving the brain health, brain function by doing that. Andrea, about the anatomy, you tackle a bit of a sort of a hippocampus. I'm sure the limbic system, which is our emotional brain, is the brainstem is involved. What is the biology and what the inflammatory markers, what are they doing when you exercise? Do we have any correlation of our sort of a neurofilament levels and the brain activity whilst you're exercising? How does that all work, and what is the connection and link between these?
So what we do know, again, from like systematic reviews, so when you pool studies together that looks at the biology or the effect if exercise has, then what we see is that there's a positive effect in terms of brain-derived neurotrophic factors. So that's coming up a lot in exercise research. And we know this is very important for maintaining the neurons or the growth or the maturation of nerve cells. We know this is very important as well in terms of brain plasticity. And we know that regular participation in exercise has this anti-inflammatory effect. And even recently, there are a number of studies coming out that's showing that people who engage in physical activity or exercise, it helps to protect the blood-brain barrier. So I see the blood-brain barrier as this little gatekeeper, preventing certain substances from damaging the CNS. So exercise is working to maintain the integrity of the blood-brain barrier, which is very important in people with MS. So yes, the caveat, though, I think worth saying here is that, the key thing is the activity needs to be regular. So not the stop-start, you do it this month, not again for 3 months. Try and get it into a habit. So it's regular activities. And usually majority of the evidence is around this moderate to vigorous activities as well to get these beneficial effects on brain health.
Wonderful. Andrea, I think there are a couple also studies to suggest that neurofilament level, which is a marker that is emerging now in our clinical field, that we measure the disease activity, and in cases that it's not clear whether it's sometimes MS or not MS, or it's just a white matter sort of small vessel disease, we do perform the neurofilament level at the beginning, at the baseline, at the day of the diagnosis, and we also use that marker to monitor the disease activity. So if you have a highly active disease, you have increased neurofilament level. And what we noticed from the studies, clinical research, that with exercises, increased amount of exercises, the neurofilament level, which is an inflammatory marker, gets lower.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a
Yes.
real anatomy and biology behind to suggest that it really has got a protective element and also anti-inflammatory element if you do continue exercising. So the maintenance, the sustainability, one exercise, one upon a time in the blue is not going to help, but doing that at least 2-3 times a week is something to pursue.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, Andrea, there is a fancy definition to describe the proper connection and wiring between the neurons. It's called neuroplasticity. It's a fancy name. It's very popular now in the MS community and elsewhere. Everyone talks about it. What is it? And do we know how does the exercise in MS, in particular MS topic, how the neuroplasticity responds to exercises and what the neuroplasticity is?
So when you talk about neuroplasticity, actually, it's the ability of the brain to change, to adapt, to reorganize itself. And there is, again, we have evidence around the role of exercise as it relates to neuroplasticity. So there's evidence of endurance training, so maybe jogging or running, or resistance training, so using weights that increases the circulatory growth factors such as like insulin type growth factors. And again, the brain-derived neurotrophic factors. And we know both play a role in brain plasticity. So it's very important. And we know that exercise plays a positive role here. And when you look at MS, you get axonal loss pretty early on and cerebral atrophy early on in the disease process. And to me, to get the beneficial effects, we really need to be exercising earlier, start these routines very early on into the disease process, so we can promote the neuroprotection, the neurogeneration, and neuroplasticity, and ultimately, which is our aim, is to reduce the long-term disability as well associated with it. So we know that exercise has this ability to make changes within the brain.
Wonderful, Andrea. So this is so innovative and new way of looking at the disease, because it almost suggests that there is an element of the repair mechanism behind, that you can train your brain to recover from the previous relapses and injuries, and moving on, building up that connectivity and wiring, better wiring within the system. And you touch the base of the insulin growth factor. That's a metabolic element and pathogenesis that is involved. And I truly start to believe that the MS is a metabolic disease too. Look at these comorbidities. Look at the microbiome. Some of the signature of the metabolites are being found within the gastrointestinal tracts, and some of them are like myoinositol is reduced in MS, and that's a regular metabolite that regulates the insulin resistance. So really important aspects here that we touched, Andrea. I can't strike the importance that we are just discussing, and there are some innovative ways of rehabilitation, and I think we should cover that to improve the neuroplasticity and improve the function living with MS. Loads of games are around, and gamification and using the virtual reality has got an emerging niche in this world living with MS. And you can buy and purchase some VR glasses these days and do some sort of games to improve the function. What do we know currently about this, Andrea?
Yeah, so again, it's an emerging field. I think in MS, it's gaining popularity. I think when you look at probably stroke, I think they have more established evidence here. But for MS, it's really emerging. What we do know from some of the systematic reviews is that you can use virtual reality to reduce disability in MS. We do know that it shows reducing fatigue. It has an impact using the MS impact scale. It improves quality of life. I think because it's an emerging field, we don't have a strong evidence base around the impact on brain health. We need more robust studies, I would say, looking at this, and more studies and good quality studies, and maybe looking at these studies with MRI markers, for example, to help us to see what's happening at that level. I think so that the evidence, it's coming out, but it's not very clear about the impact on neuroplasticity.
Okay. So that's something to look forward, I believe so. Maybe it's just the design the design of
I think so.
might not be robust, and it's something that if you are into games, if you have certain behavior towards gaming and doing some sort of finding innovative ways of living this life, so that's something to think about and perhaps get engaged, because it's all going to give you a huge benefit, because there are games in a VR and metaverse where you actually physically can do some boxing and certain exercises, very sort of an interplay between the reality and the virtual reality, that there is a blended effect, and it has got some suggestion that it has got a really positive effect in neurorehabilitation, living with a long-term condition such as stroke and multiple sclerosis.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, when I used to work a lot more in rehab and use virtual reality, it's very engaging. And people, you have to choose who will engage with it, but it can be very engaging and very motivating, and can be used as a tool. It's another adjunct and another tool that we have in our armory to help to get people to be more active. Definitely.
Wonderful, Andrea. Thank you very much for that. Andrea, as everything in this life, there is a lot of limitation. When we talk about the research studies in multiple sclerosis, I noticed just going through and searching the publications around the rehabilitation,
Mm,
physiotherapy, and multiple sclerosis, there are some sort of studies that are focused more on people who are more mobile and
mhm,
less studies that are around people who are very severely disabled. What
mhm.
is your opinion on the limitation of the research studies in multiple sclerosis? What is happening here?
Yeah, it's a recurring theme. If you read the literature, you have to read it in with these lens on. So I think there are lots of limitations, and one of the limitations is around the sample size. Often studies have small numbers when you look at exercise studies, so we need a lot more multi-center, larger trials. Majority of the studies tend to focus on people who are mildly to moderately affected with MS. So yes, as you mentioned, people with EDSS less than 6. I think also the studies are um, in terms of people with advanced MS, they're underrepresented in exercise studies. I think it's changing slowly, but I think there's an underrepresentation there. I think researchers are not very explicit in terms of exercise principles. So you need to be very clear about you're telling people the type of activity, the frequency, how often, the intensity that they're working at as well, and the duration. Because if you want to replicate a study, these are very important. And again, I think most of the studies are limited because of the outcome measures that are used, quite limiting, and they focus at what I consider at an impairment level. And I think we need to expand our outcome measures to look more, okay, at an activity level. How does this intervention, how does this impact on your day-to-day activities? How does this intervention impact on your participation, which we hardly measure, your participation at work or leisure activities or activities within the community? I think there's lots to do there. Studies lack diversity in terms of age. What's the impact of exercise on people with older than 60 years? Again, ethnicity. We need more diverse populations to come forward. We need to recruit them as well for research. But going back to your question around, so many limitations. So why do studies focus so much on the mild to moderate? It's interesting. I personally think it's a pragmatic decision. You have more activities that you can do with people who are less than EDSS 6. So there's some restrictions to mobility. I think they're easier to conduct in terms of research trials because usually there's a cost implication for research. And personally, I think exercise studies or physical activity studies, they're under-resourced, I should say. So not much funding. And I think researchers are really trying to do their best with the funding they have. But when you have people with EDSS greater than 6.5 or 7, for example, there might be a cost implication in terms of you need to think about the equipment that you're going to use. They might need additional support, travel to get to the location. So I think it's probably a pragmatic decision, but because it's this recurring theme that's plaguing exercise studies, I think it's something worth looking into, so we know that the evidence base, we have a lot more evidence for people who are mildly to moderately affected with MS, not so much around people with advanced MS. It's changing, but let's get more studies done in this area as well. But if you're going to do that, I think you have to look at the outcome measures that you're using to measure change, especially at this level.
Wonderful. This is a great advice for somebody who's planning to conduct a new research in MS and rehabilitation. Just follow our recommendations and you will be okay. And the limitation will be overcome by all of us as a group of researchers, if we are more focused and tackling
Absolutely.
all these aspects that we just discussed. Wonderful. Andrea, what is the minimal that people can do to maintain the function and to improve maybe and to reduce the activity and prevent from becoming disabled. If you are as fit as gold living with MS, what would be the minimum people should do? And if you are a wheelchair user, what should you do to maintain the function and to feel better about yourself too?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's interesting because you're saying the minimum. So it's a minimum that you can do to get these benefits. I get this question quite a bit in clinic as well. Like, what should I do? What's the bare minimum? What should I do? Okay. So what we recommend is at least start with at least not start, I should say. I'm going to give you the recommendations and then I'll tell you what I think. So the recommended minimum is 30 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise on 2 days or 2 to 3 days per week. And you need to get some resistance or weight training in as well, 2 to 3 days per week. So that's the minimum. For people who are less than EDSS-6 or people who are mildly impacted by MS, for example, there's a wide range of activities open for them. So you can do aerobic exercise, usually 2 to 3 times per week, maybe 10 to 30 minutes of moderate intensity activities, or treadmill, jogging, cycle ergonometry, HIIT exercise. We're getting, there's a lot of evidence coming around about high intensity interval training as well. So you could do this once per week, around 30 to 90 seconds, rest break in between. Always remember, rest break. And then make sure you get some resistance training 2 to 3 times per week. Again, flexibility exercises, balance, falls prevention exercises. But when you start to think about people who are in a wheelchair, for example, so those who are limited in terms of their mobility, this is where I think personal dosing comes in. I think you need support to really exercise. So what we recommend at this level is try to do up to 20 minutes per day if you can, 3 to 7 days a week. But the caveat here is work at your own pace. Start where you are and build. I always tell patients to do that irrespective of their disability level, actually. And something that's not often spoken about, you can accumulate activities. So you can do it for shorter sessions. So if you can't do for 30 minutes, or if you can't do for 15 minutes, you can do for shorter sessions, shorter bursts. And that's okay as well. The key thing is to get you moving. The other thing for people who are severely disabled, breathing exercise. Don't forget breathing exercise, very important at that level. Can use even a simple spirometer to help you. Arm movement, so you might not be able to use your lower limbs, for example, but cycle ergonometry or exercise using your hands, weights. If you can stand, what you can do. If you can stand, I would say do sit to stand practice. If you need help to stand, there are standing frames that you can use. Don't forget posture exercises, especially for people who are limited with mobility, head up, shoulders back, that sort of thing. So don't forget those simple principles as well, but start where you are and build is the key message.
Wonderful. And don't be scared, don't be afraid, and don't have this fear that is going to worsen your situation. It's not. You start with the small steps and you build up that level of exercise. And then the other aspect is always have rest, because exercise, in other words, is a stress to your body. We all know that. And we do that for a purpose, because we improve the circulation, the metabolism increases, you get loads of other benefits from the cardiovascular perspective, neuroplasticity, diminished markers and inflammatory markers in particular. All that is behind the scenes. But, when you rest, you have a lot of going on as well in your brain and body.
That's it. That's good.
Yeah. So the pandemic had a really negative effect on everyone's lives, whether you're fit, whether you're healthy, whether you have long-term conditions such as multiple sclerosis. So as a physiotherapist, Andrea, What have you learned from people with MS in pandemic? Have they been creative? Like, we all were all locked in our own houses. We didn't have any social life going on. We were in a stagnation mood, attached to the sofas and beds and kitchen. What have you learned, Andrea?
Very interesting question. I think to put the pandemic as it relates to exercise and physical activity into context, I think we have to go back a little bit to see what was going on before the pandemic in people with MS and exercise. And one of the things was around this body of knowledge or that we know that people with MS tend to report lower physical activity levels and have increased sedentary behaviors. Now, we don't talk a lot about sedentary behaviors, but it's just as important as physical activity. So we know that was happening. In fact, we know that about 20% of people with MS actually meet the recommended guidance in terms of physical activity. So what happened during the pandemic, there was a mixed bag. So what I've seen is some people who used to exercise stopped. Some people who didn't exercise started exercising. But overall, when you look at it as a whole, it had a negative impact on people. Overall, physical activity, I would say, was reduced. But what I've learned, I don't know if people were being ultra creative. I know healthcare professionals were trying to be creative. So there was a flurry of online resources made available for people with MS. But some people were accessing it, but not all, which is interesting. So there was a lot of stuff going on around even online exercise, but people weren't necessarily tapping into it because you'll ask them in clinic, but what they were doing, people were walking. Maybe they weren't walking at the intensity that we wanted them to, but they were actually walking, right?
Yeah.
People were going out for walks because you were allowed to go out for walks. People who had dogs, I had to take my dog out. So that kind of forced physical activity as well. So I would say there was a mixed picture. So not necessarily creative, but they return to, I would say, the lower level physical activity, because I know we trump vigorous, or you need to be working at vigorous, moderate to vigorous intensity. That changed during the pandemic, but people, at least they were improving their sedentary behaviors based on the people that I saw in clinic. But I know overall, there was a reduction in physical activity.
And some deconditioning too, Andrea, right? So some people
and deconditioning, yeah, you're right. And when you look at literature, and this was right across the board, so if you look at studies that were coming out from America, Australia, even Europe, what you show is this overall reducing physical activity levels. It had an impact on worsening disability, fatigue, depression, increased weight as well. That came out from the literature. A lot falls, and I saw that clinically as well. People were reporting more falls, and as a result, less confidence with walking and engaging in physical activities. So deconditioning, yeah.
Yeah, which is sad, but you can always start again. It's not there. It's never
Yes,
too late. It's never
no,
too late. Yeah.
that's the message.
Right. Okay, Andrea. I get some interesting inquiries and activities that people do purchase fancy things sometimes, and something also very simple like squeezing balls, to improve the hand function. Let's talk about the common physical struggles living with MS. Quite often, I see people having a foot drop. They wear sometimes braces. Sometimes these braces don't fit their shoes, and there is a huge struggle with a foot drop. There is an increased chance and risk of falling. How people can help themselves with the simple tools around, like buying on Amazon some squeezing balls to improve the hand function. What would be your practical recommendation around this? Some people buy and purchase by themselves the electric stimulation, and is it safe to do such a thing without any supervision and having a physiotherapy assessment beforehand? How does that work in this world?
Wow. Okay, put it this way. You have what you recommend and you have what people do. Okay, so I think there are two different things. So if people want to help themselves, there are lots of ways, as you mentioned. You can buy gadgets online. The issue I have with squeezing balls is it's good to get a particular movement going, yeah, but people squeeze the balls and they forget to release it. So you need both actions, the flexion and the extension of it. My personal take on this is I would prefer people to be assessed. I know it's not always possible because there's a resource issue at the moment and difficulty accessing services. But you find that a lot of people struggle because they're not getting the right support or the support at the right time. So that's my personal view, because in the grand scheme of things, if you are supported, when you need that support and have somebody to come in and do an assessment and say, okay, this is appropriate, this is an appropriate aid, these are the activities that you need to do, I think that will give you a better outcome. Now you will say to me, oh, well, people can't access physiotherapy services. It's hard to access. I know it's hard to access. It's hard for me to access it sometimes as well. And so people sometimes are forced to go out and buy aids that they think might help. But I think you need to be assessed. That's my preferred statement. I think you need the support. I'll tell you why. I saw, and I think there are some assumptions as well that needs to be challenged a little bit. And I know I tread carefully here because, for example, I'll just give you a quick example. Sometimes I sit with a patient, I observe them walking. I know they're tripping over their foot. I'll ask them, are you falling? They say, no, I'm not falling. I'm like, okay, do you get near misses at home? So, you stumble, but you don't fall. To me, that's a risk in itself, because if you have a number of stumbles, eventually that might lead to a fall. And to me, with my physio hat on, I'm thinking, if you have a fall, you're going to lose confidence in your mobility. You may fracture or, and so you want to prevent these things. But I've had conversations with people and I say, you could get a simple foot-up splint that could help you. There are different types of splints, and that's why I'm saying it's best to be assessed to know what the right splint is for you. But sometimes a simple foot-up splint can help you in terms of keeping the momentum going, in terms of your walking and getting your foot to clear the floor. But sometimes people see getting that as giving into the condition, or they see it as, oh, that means I'm progressing. And sometimes it takes a number of discussions with the person to actually say, but this is how I see it. If we do this, it reduces your risk of falls. It keeps you on your feet for longer. That's what we want to do. We want to keep you mobile for longer, and get you confident doing that and doing the things that you enjoy doing. So sometimes we have to challenge those assumptions. But I know people go out and get things, but my preference would be for them to be actually supported and assessed properly.
So really the best way is tailored, personalized assessment. And the management then is adapted to your own needs, and you're at the center as the patient. But in this situations that you really struggle, you know that you live a sedentary lifestyle and you need to do something, and you know that exactly. It's not going to harm you if you get a squeezing ball for your hand function to squeeze on a daily, maybe some resistance bands and other explorative work that you put an effort, you invest. And if it works for you as a person living with a MS, we would need to celebrate that. It's not going to harm you anyhow. It really needs to feel good for you, and that's the way forward.
Absolutely. And you hit on something. It needs to be meaningful. It needs to be fun, something that you enjoy. And there are simple things that you can do. So for example, with your hand function, I sometimes I say to patients, oh, just get a little trinket box, put different size coins in there or beads or different objects, practice picking them up, rather than putting everything on one level on your shelf. Why don't you put some on another shelf so that you get some reaching going? So there are simple things, but to be honest, Agne, the simple things that we do around our home in our daily life activities, it's about movement. Get moving.
Yeah, absolutely. So simple daily tasks. If you can still maintain the tidy room, tidy house, that's the way forward, to yeah. All right. Okay.
That's it.
Andrea, such a lovely time talking to you. I've learned enormous amount of the practicalities here. It's something that I never thought. And I'll give you an example that having an assisted gadgets or braces or a stick, for majority may feel like I'm losing the battle. I'm now becoming disabled. This is such a wrong mindset. This is actually going to complement, it's going to improve your function, that you could actually do more to maintain your function, to keep your cardiovascular system up and going, to improve your circulation, because you're automatically going to do much, much more. It's not losing the battle. It's really learning how to live, how to adapt, and in ideal world, getting an assessment, getting care being personalized, more holistic, and don't forget to move, because that's a way of keeping your brain active, of keeping your body fit, and improving multiple functions from the molecular level to the physical objective at the organ level function.
That's it. The whole gamut.
Andrea, I just want to ask you a couple more last questions here, and see how do you cope in this life, from your personal perspective. What do you have as a quote you live your life by, or you think often?
I wouldn't say I have a particular quote per se, but I live by this principle. For me, let peace rule your heart. So I try to be at a place with peace. If I find that sometimes your schedule gets a little bit out of sync, I recognize when that's happening, and I try to draw myself back in. I'm like, okay, slow down, Stennett.
Yes, yeah. Slow down. And slowing down, when you try to be mindful, this is how it feels on your body and mind. You become slower. But that's nourishing your body and mind.
That's it. Mental health. It's very important.
Yeah. The right mindset will keep you going. You will be much more engaging with the physical program, physical exercises. That's so powerful, Andrea. That's really amazing to hear all that. It's the way we look at the brain health and how to preserve the brain health is not just one aspect of being active and exercise. It's the whole body that is engaging with all these activities, and how you set up the right environment for you to, and conditions. Perhaps when you are very under a lot of stress and anxious, and your life it feels is collapsing, perhaps it's not the right time to start exercising on the top of that, although it would be very beneficial. But you really need to be in the right mindset to set the program that you're going to sustain. That is going to be a persistent program. You're going to continue that, and this is where the whole benefit comes. If you do that on a regular basis, 2-3 times a week at least, and then you move on. You become motivated, you feel better about yourself, your body improves, you maybe lose some weight as well, and that's a sort of a vicious cycle, spiral up, and you just feel so good living with this long-term condition. And forgetting about this condition is not a priority. It's not who you are. It's not your identity. You are who you are, and MS is just living with a long-term condition, which is unfortunate. It's a horrible thing to have, but there's no other way. finding the way to be positive and finding your right attitude and healthy attitude towards the nutrition, diet, exercise, and mindset is the way how we should all perform these days.
Absolutely. That's the way to go.
Andrea, I promise, very last question. So we ask our guests to ask questions to each other. So we had the last guest here at Be Well with MS podcast. He was Associate Professor Rod Middleton, who works for MS Registry. And his question was around the comorbidities and how to measure disability living with MS. A lot of people have one or two comorbidities, and that can worsen the outcomes. People become even more disabled and they have impaired function if they live with diabetes, cardiovascular disease, short of breath that limits them to exercise and do various different things in this life. And EDSS limitation, which is our disability assessment score that we use quite often in our clinics and research, there is a limitation around this scale. And what would be your advice to measure the function, to measure the early signs of the disability and prevent people from getting worse?
So it comes back to movement, and something that we didn't go into because this is such a big area, right? But if you notice during our conversation, I was talking about exercise. I was also talking about physical activity. But in fact, what we need to do is define what we mean by these terms. So when you talk about physical activity, it's a broad spectrum. It's a range of activities. It's how it's expending energy doing different types of activities. So it could be occupational activities, daily life activities. It could be leisure activities as well. Exercise is actually a subset of that. Now, when it comes on to the literature and the outcome measures that we use, I think it's very limited. And it focuses a lot on impairment. And what we need to be looking at more widely. So with the EDSS, it has it looks at different areas, but it's limited in terms of mobility. So it's restricted based on like the distance you're able to walk, but there's so many other measures. You have the timed 25-foot walk test. So that looks at walking function. You have the 9-hole peg test that looks at hand function. In terms of cognition, we use a lot the symbol digit modalities test as well. So that gives you an idea of how you are performing over time. And, and beyond that, so those look at like an impairment level activity. How do you transfer? How do you walk? So having outcome measures that look at activity as well. And I'm going to push that a little bit further as well. Outcome measures that look at participation. So how do you participate in daily life activities, your roles in the home, your role in the family, leisure type activities, sports. So our outcome measures are very restrictive at the moment. And if you're really looking at a holistic MS care, we have to look at the outcome measures that we're using to dictate whether or not an intervention is beneficial. And I'll just put one more thing in there as well. I looked at exercise and physical activity a few years ago from the patient's perspective. And this is something that we don't often measure. But what I found from that, if you think about the ICF, looks at impairment, activity, participation, and then you have the environmental factors. What I found in people with MS, they look at it in a different way. So I call it flipping the ICF. It's actually what drives them is the fun activities, the meaning the activity has for them. Those are the motivation factors. So if we can tap into those things that's meaningful to the individual, it's fun to them, they're more likely to engage in it over time. Yes. Sustained it over time. It becomes part of what we do in life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we need to tap into. And we don't tap into that a lot, because if you can get to the why, it's a motivation level. Why would you want to do this? Then you tap into another area. So absolutely. That's maybe something else for another time.
Yes, Andrea, absolutely. When you know why, you automatically know how.
That's it.
Yes,
That's it.
yeah, and I think it is inspiration, and you don't need to suffer, you don't need
That's it.
to feel bad. Everything we talk today is about feeling good, feeling that it's fun, it's nice, it's amazing, and it's really giving you a lot of positivity. So with that, Andrea, so exciting, and I'm so grateful for you to join me today. I'm really, really thank you for being around and having a discussion around the physical exercises and how to preserve the brain health. This is an opportunity for me and everyone else. You're amazing physiotherapist, Andrea. Such a pleasure having you. I wish you all the best, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you.
Oh, yes, yes. And thank you for having me as well. It's a pleasure having this conversation, and have a great Christmas, my favorite time of the year.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye for now.